What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's Mr. Clements. We're going to talk a little bit today about Thomas Jefferson's presidency and the Louisiana Purchase. Now, perhaps the most important thing that Thomas Jefferson did during his presidency was to buy the Louisiana territory from France. French leader Napoleon Bonaparte had held control of this territory in Louisiana, and his plan was to eventually grow food for it for his other colonies in the West Indies, which were a little bit more profitable in terms of creating cash crops for trade, but weren't real great for growing food. When these colonies revolted, though, and ended up declaring their independence from France, he decided that he could better use that money to fund his wars in Europe, mainly against Great Britain. When American delegates Robert Livingston and James Monroe offered to buy New Orleans, the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand first refused. Later, he offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory. Although Jefferson had only authorized them to offer $10 million, they knew that the offer was too good to refuse, so they offered $15 million for the entire Louisiana territory. French Minister Talleyrand accepted, and the size of the United States doubled overnight. Now, what the United States really wanted out of the Louisiana territory was the port of New Orleans, or what later became the city of New Orleans. It's right at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and this is the river that goes north to south and cuts the United States in half. And it was really important at the time because it was the most powerful way to trade things that were being grown in the Northwest Territory, what was eventually going to become Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, etc., not to mention Tennessee and Kentucky, which are all these areas where either becoming states, had become states, or were territories that belonged to the United States already. So they really wanted New Orleans because that would allow them to use the river, sail their goods down to the port of New Orleans, and then transport everything out through the Gulf of Mexico and into the Atlantic Ocean, either for trade with Britain or France or other countries in Europe, or just to get it over to Boston and New York and the other East Coast cities. Now, one of the major questions about the Louisiana Purchase was it constitutional? Remember, Jefferson believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. That means that he believed that what the Constitution said is what goes, and there should be no room for wiggle room, such as the Elastic Clause that the Federalists really believed in, which stated that anything that was necessary and proper for the good of the country could be done by Congress. Jefferson really believed that as president, he did not have the power to purchase land, but ultimately the Louisiana Purchase was just too good of a deal to pass up. So he finally decided that he was going to have to do this. He realized that he did have the power to make treaties, so he did all of this as a treaty with France, and just so happened that in the treaty, the United States would be taking control of that land, and France would be taking control of $15 million. At his request, Congress approved the treaty, and in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase went into effect. Jefferson knew it was a great deal for the United States, but he really knew very little about the territory. So he hires Meriwether Lewis, his private secretary, to go on an expedition, which is like a long voyage of exploration. He asked them to map out a route to the Pacific Ocean and told them to study the geography and territory of the area, including things like plants and animals. He asked them to establish a peaceful relationship with any Indian people there, and if possible, find a Northwest Passage, a waterway to the Pacific Ocean. People had been looking for this since settlers first landed on the eastern coast of the United States, way back in the time of the Pilgrims, and there was still some belief that it might be out there. And of course we now know it's not, but Jefferson was hoping that they were going to find it. Lewis asked William Clark to go with him. The two men quickly built what they called the Corps of Discovery. This included York, an enslaved African American who had been with Clark since they were kids. The group also included roughly 50 volunteers of mainly soldiers and hunters. The group traveled across Missouri, following the Missouri River up into what is present-day Kansas, Nebraska, and eventually into North Dakota. They were really hoping that this Missouri River was going to turn into the Northwest Passage. It didn't. They wrote down all of these tales of these huge grassy plains with immense herds of buffalo and deer and elk and antelope. They carried with them fishhooks and mirrors, beads and knives and blankets and sewing needles, and they also carried with them peace medals that they had stamped with the seal of the United States to trade with Native Americans. While in North Dakota, they met a group of Indians known as the Mandan and a woman named Sacagawea. She belonged to the Shoshone people who lived in the Rocky Mountains, and along with her French-Canadian husband, she agreed to help Lewis and Clark cross the mountain range. In early spring, the group set out over the Rocky Mountains, and eventually they met up with Sacagawea's brother. They received food and horses from the Shoshone people, and with their help, they were able to cross the Continental Divide. It's a mountain range that separates river systems and causes them to flow in opposite directions, so that all of the water that lands on this side of the mountain range will flow this way, and all of the water that lands on this side of a mountain range will flow this way. In the United States, that's the Rocky Mountains, and most of the water spills towards the Pacific Ocean going one way, and then eventually towards either the Missouri and Mississippi River, and thus out into the Gulf of Mexico if it lands on the other side of the Rockies. Eventually, the two men reached the Pacific Ocean, though they never did find that Northwest Passage because it isn't there. Their return trip took another year, and in 1806, the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis, where they started from. They brought back a great deal of information about the new United States territory. Now, at the same time, another American named Zebulon Pike was exploring around the same region. Except the region that he was exploring, he kind of went the other direction towards the southwestern part of the United States, out of the Louisiana Territory, in what was at the time controlled by Spain. He had started off exploring a different portion of the Mississippi River and then went south of the Missouri River into what is now Colorado, New Mexico, and Mexico. Spanish officials eventually kidnapped Zebulon Pike and confiscated all of his maps, except for one that he hid inside the gun barrel. The journeys of both Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike taught Americans a great deal about the wild territory to the west of the United States and paved a way for the expansion west that would come later. In 1812, the territory around New Orleans had gained so many Americans that it was admitted as the state of Louisiana.